Have you ever had someone stand up for you? Maybe you're going through a trial, you're going through a circumstance, and maybe you can think back to school and a time where maybe gossip was going around. Or you were going through a trial with a friend or a family situation and you really had nowhere to go. You felt that way and someone came alongside you and stood up for you. You know, as we've gone through this whole grace series, we've talked about all the basics of grace. We talked about bankruptcy, that it's not a works-based righteousness. We talked about how we're called to love, how Christ loved us, and we talked about obedience. For 3 weeks, we hit home that if we love Christ, if we love Jesus, Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commands. But it gets to the point, we can know all of this and know the foundations of grace, but it comes down to the point is it's got to become personal to you. And we're going to, as we end this series, we have 2 videos left. This is today's, and then we have one more next week. And we're going to end by talking about how God's grace is so personal. It's just for you. And it would be a tragedy to go through this whole series where we talk about everything you can know about grace, and yet you don't take it to heart and realize that God's grace is just for you. We're going to look at a passage in John 8 in this lesson that talks about how Christ got so personal with a woman who had nowhere else to go. And we're going to look at that in John chapter 8. But before we read this passage about the adulterous woman, I want to set the stage. Right before this passage, people were going around town talking about who Jesus was. People were hearing about this man. And of course the Pharisees and the people of the Jewish elect were talking about how they believed Jesus was just a demon-possessed man. They were saying that he was just a mere prophet and he's no way the Messiah. But others were saying, no, he is Christ. He is God's Son. He is our Messiah. So there's a lot of debate going on who Christ is. So the Pharisees were going out of their way to try to disprove who he was and who he was saying he was going to be. And we find this passage in John 8. It picks up right after all that debate, right about all the debate about who Christ was. And I want to read this passage, and then we're going to look at it a little more in detail. But pay attention to how God's grace is so personal. And then at the end of the passage, the calling that's on our lives when we realize that. So check this out. In John 8, we're going to be looking at just verses 1 through 11. So let's read that together. It says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him. And he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What do you say?' They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her.' Again he stooped down on the ground and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones left first until only Jesus was left with this woman. Jesus straightened up and asked her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' 'No one, sir,' she said. 'Then neither do I condemn you,' Jesus declared. 'Go now and leave your life of sin.'" Kristen and I, my wife and I, a few years back did a Holy Lands trip, and we went to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, Galilee. We went to all the places that Jesus walked. We ended our trip in Nazareth, actually, and we got to see all the areas where Jesus walked and lived during his life. And I remember we went to Capernaum and Jerusalem. We got to see these amazing old temples, and they had these pillars like this, but they were just monstrous. I mean, these areas were huge. In this one place they were excavating right outside the old city of Jerusalem, we got to see the steps of an old temple that they believe would have been around during the time of Christ. And these steps were monstrous, and it made me think how huge the temple would have been and how huge the temple courts would have been. So you can picture in this passage, it says people were gathered around when the Pharisees brought this woman in the temple court. So it had to be packed. There had to be hundreds and maybe thousands of people in the temple courts. And the Pharisees bring this woman in, this poor woman who, yes, committed an act of adultery, but she was being used as a test subject. They didn't care about her. They just wanted to use her to test Jesus. And the way they tested him was they gave him no way out in this circumstance, because what they did was they brought her in and said, now should we condemn her, and do you believe we should condemn her? And here's the trap they had for Christ. According to the law in Deuteronomy, if anybody was caught in the act of adultery willfully, not during rape or where they tried to get away, but if they acted willfully in the act of adultery, they were to be stoned. So according to the law, Christ needed to say, yes, she should be stoned. And also he was caught that if he did that, the Romans at that point had taken away the right of the Jews to actually execute people for religious purposes. So there, if he says yes, he can't even do that. And then if the other way, if he says no, he's breaking the law. So either way, if he says yes, stone her, he can't, according to the new law where the Roman says the Jews have no right to execute people anymore. And if he says don't stone her, he's breaking the Jewish law. So he's trapped here, and he has nowhere to go with his answers. But he takes the direction off this woman and puts it right on the Pharisees. And he stoops down on the ground. We don't know what he wrote. But whatever he did caused these men to start to leave. And I love this passage because think about this. These temple courts would have been filled. There would have been people everywhere. And in the end, it says that everyone left until only Jesus and this woman was left. Is that not the picture of the personal grace that God has given us through Jesus Christ? This woman who thought she was at the point of death, she was mere moments away from being killed by being stoned, people everywhere to observe this, is now standing in the empty temple courts. Everyone has cleared away, and it's just her and Christ. And God looks at her and says, does anyone condemn you? And she says, no. And Christ says, no, neither do I. But then he follows up and tells her what? He tells her, now go and leave your life of sin. There's a new calling on her life. You know, just like Jesus Christ in this passage stood up for this woman, he has done the same for you. This whole series has been on grace, and it has to get personal. It has to get inside of your heart where you start to live brand new, realizing that this grace is just for me. You know, the Gospels, every single Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, gives a depiction of the suffering Christ went through for us. And I don't know why God let the Holy Spirit to move through the apostles here, the disciples in here in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to write this description, but for some reason he wanted us to see the pain and suffering Christ went through for us. And I want you to think about this. Think about you are at the point of death. You have nowhere to go. And this is what Jesus takes on for you so you can be set free. I'm going to read just the account in Matthew. In Matthew 27, verses 27 through 31, listen to what Jesus went through just for you. It says, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the courts and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his clothes on him. Then they led him away to be crucified. The same description is both in Mark, Luke, and John as well. And at Refinery Life Group last week, we read all the accounts of how Jesus suffered for our sin. And we talked about through God's grace, Jesus stood up for us. He took on that beating. He took on the crucifixion of the cross so you can be set free. You know, you and I are this adulterous woman in the story of John chapter 8. Because of our sin, we were deserving of death, but Jesus stood in the gap, and God now looks upon us and sees Jesus Christ. And because of that, we are set free. So my question to you is, how can you not then stand up for Christ? Look at all that he has done for you. If you truly understand grace and you take it on a personal level, Your life needs to be changed. And that's why we talked about how we need to be compelled by love. Obedience doesn't come from a set of rules. It comes from understanding how personal God's grace is for you. My challenge for you is, as we end this series, dig deeper into His Word, into these stories of Christ and how His grace is personal. It's just for you. And my challenge for you is, are you going to start standing up for Him in your everyday life? We're praying for you. We hope you have a great end of the year as Christmas is upon us. We have one more lesson, and my prayer for you is that God's grace becomes personal starting this week. Have a great week.